Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of Shakin' Hands. I'm your host, Jack Moran. You can find me on Instagram at Blue Collar Kid. That is Blue Collar KEHD. We have a super interesting guest today, Michael Aponte. He's one of the leaders of the MIT card counting team that inspired the book Bringing Down the House and the critically acclaimed movie 21. Now he works as a data analytics consultant and is working on a couple projects at the same time, doing some documentary series about blackjack. Is that correct?
Yeah, related documentary series we've been on production on for a year, and then developing a few television shows as well.
So kind of like we always like to start by saying, like, giving you a chance to talk about your story. Like, what is your story? How did you get into card counting? It's a pretty wild story.
Yeah, so I think the thing that I'm most known for is being one of the leaders of the MIT card counting team. So this was something that I didn't plan on at all. Like, growing up, I was never even into card games. Like, I was far more interested in sports and doing well in school. And then my senior at MIT, one of my best friends recruited me to join a card counting team. And so I didn't know what to make of it, what he was saying. I didn't know the first thing about card counting, much less that it could be a team activity. But of course, I was really intrigued, so I agreed to attend my first team meeting. And then that's when I learned that card counting, it's this legitimate, mathematically based system that can legally give players an edge over the house. So that was pretty cool because I've always been a math guy. And then there was the whole visceral appeal that would appeal to any college student, right? I would have the opportunity if I could make it through the training, if I became good at it, I could become what they call the big player. So I would have the opportunity to bet like thousands of dollars and get treated like a king by the casinos. So kind of that more superficial appeal was pretty big in the beginning, but then once I got into it, I just really became engrossed with the challenge of kind of both the art and science of it, like executing the system perfectly while completely fooling the casino. Because the art of it's really important. You have to be able to fly under the radar because, as everyone knows, the casinos kind of have a double standard as to your skill. It's fine if you're not very knowledgeable about a game, but if you're actually skilled and you win over the long run, they have the right and they will ask you not to play.
So how similar is the story that I haven't read the book, but I've seen the movie. How similar is that story to like what it actually was? Is it pretty aligned or is it a little more dramatized?
Well, as far as the movie, which is how most people are familiar with the story of our team, it's completely Hollywood version.
Right.
Like, could not really be much further removed.
No way.
But it's not surprising. It's Hollywood.
Like, what are the main differences?
Well, I mean, obviously with the movie, you're restricted to what? Up to two
hours, yeah.
But and then basically everything, nothing was accurate at all other than MIT students counting cards. But as far as what's interesting about the team, like the whole origin actually goes way back to early 1960s. There was a professor at MIT named Ed Thorpe who, purely out of intellectual curiosity, was curious if you could actually gain an advantage in blackjack. And so at the time, he had access to MIT supercomputers. So those computers were the biggest, baddest computers in the world. I think maybe you've heard of them. They're the ones that had the huge tubes and they would take up like multiple floors. No. Have you ever heard about the old school computer?
It's like Enigma. I've heard of that supercomputer.
Similar, but I mean, but it's what's interesting is that it's like that supercomputer is like so much. It's so weak compared to our iPhones these days. Obviously, with technology, a huge weak part of it is just our ability over time to make things really small. But with supercomputers, he was able to derive card counting. So it was the first strategy that can legally give players an advantage through a betting strategy. And so simply put, in blackjack, as the cards come out, they give you real information about the probability of what's going to happen next, right? So that's very different than a game like roulette. Like roulette, every time you spin the wheel, it's a brand new ball game, right? The odds are permanently fixed in roulette. So there's no such thing as a good roulette player or a bad roulette player. Everyone's an equally losing player. It's just a matter of the more hours you play, the more you bet, the more you're going to lose, right? So the odds are static they're called independent event-based games. But blackjack is based on dependent events because the odds of what happens next depends on like what's happened in the past. So a simple example, if you're playing single deck blackjack and 4 aces come out in the first round, like what would your odds be of getting blackjack the next round? Given that there are only 4 aces.
Very low, right?
It would be
zero,
exactly.
Yeah, zero.
So that would be a bad time to bet a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so the odds in blackjack are constantly fluctuating up and down in terms of the house edge. Whereas a game like craps, roulette, the house edge is constant. It's flat.
Oh, okay.
Over time. So when you have a game in which the house edge is flat, there's zero skill. Like your decisions have no impact on your long-term outcome. But
it's pretty irrational to even play then.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I would have never. I definitely would have never played any casino game if it wasn't for card counting, because it is irrational, right, to wager money when you're more than likely to lose.
Right. So what is like the premise of the card counting analytics? Like how do you get that edge over the casino?
Well, the way card counting works is a card counting system. It's much simpler than people think. So I had the same misconceptions. So before I joined the team and learned what it was really about, my only reference point to card counting was the movie Rain Man. So I thought you had to have a photographic memory, which, I mean, I have a decent memory, but I don't have a photographic memory.
Yeah.
The thing in card counting, you're not actually memorizing the cards. You're just keeping track of the net difference between high cards and low cards. So you have the high cards are 10, Jack, Queen, King, Ace. Those cards favor the player over the long run, because first and foremost, those are the cards that give you blackjack, which pays 3-2. That's 150% on your return. If you think about it, when the dealer gets blackjack, the dealer only gets even money from you. You're not required to pay them 3-2. So that's big for the player. Also, players have options the dealer doesn't have. The dealer has to play like a robot, right? But players can, for example, double down. They can split. So when you take advantage of those options, if there's more high cards remaining, right, that's where you make your money, right? As a card, when you double down 11, you want to get a 10, not a 2.
You're right.
For example. So 10 through ace, those are the high cards. And now on the flip side, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, those are the low cards. Those favor the dealer. So for anyone that's played blackjack, they know the pain of like the dealer having 15 and you're excited because you think, oh, the dealer's going to bust, and then pulling a 4, a 5, or a 6 and like wiping out the whole table. So that's one of the ways in which low cards favor the dealer. They also help out the house in that the more low cards remaining, then the fewer player blackjacks, and then the less favorable draws when players do double down and split. And then there's an equal amount in any number of decks, like at the start of a new shuffle, regardless of whether it's single deck, double deck, 6 deck, or 8 deck. At the start of a new shuffle, there's an equal amount of high cards and low cards. They balance each other out. But as you can imagine, as soon as the dealer starts dealing, the net difference between them is going to be going up and down. So it stands to reason that if you've seen a surplus of low cards, that there has to be a surplus of high cards remaining, which means that's when the advantage starts moving into the player's favor, right? When you're more likely to get the blackjacks and the good double downs and splits over time. So the idea is, the approach is to bet little or nothing when you don't have the advantage. And then when the advantage moves into your favor as a card counter, you bet proportionally more based on how big the advantage is. So it's really actually straightforward. You can explain card counting to someone literally in a few minutes. But the hard part, as in many things, is the art of it. You have to practice, because there's a skill component to be able to apply that strategy flawlessly, which takes practice.
What is that skill component?
It's actually,
you obviously have to be pretty focused to keep an eye on the count.
Focus. It's like any skill. It's just you have to put in the time. The reason why most people that try to count cards fail is that it's human nature. They learn the system on YouTube, and it is simple, but there's a big distance between knowing how something works and then being able to actually do it. Apply it. And you can't take that shortcut, right? You have to practice, right? It's like if you had a great, the best golf coach in the world, and he's telling you like methods and techniques to improve your swing. Well, that doesn't automatically make you a better golfer.
Right.
You have to go out and practice, right? You got to put that into motion such that it becomes wired into your system. Does that make sense? So with enough practice, card counting becomes so second nature that you don't even think about it. And so that was one of the big keys to success. We had a whole training system that everyone had to go through and pass before they're ever allowed to set foot in the casino.
What did that look like?
Well, the first test was basic strategy. So basic strategy is the set of playing decisions for every hand in blackjack. So for example, have you played blackjack?
Not many times. I like poker, but blackjack is just like, there's a lot of strategy involved, and I get laughed at by the guys at the table anytime I've ever played. They're like, don't hit here, you hit over.
Well, one of the things I love about blackjack, it's actually much simpler, and it's a much shorter learning curve if you put in the time to become, to master it as compared to poker.
Right.
But like, for example, if you have a 12 and the dealer has a 3, that's a hand that gamblers they waffle on all the time. Like half of them will hit, half of them will stand, and then a good number of them will alternate between hitting and standing. Whereas like a professional blackjack player, they know that the correct play for that hand is to hit. And so for every single hand, there's a correct optimal decision. And we didn't figure this out that as a team in the same way that we didn't invent card counting. Basic strategy has been around since the mid-1950s. That's when some army mathematicians derived it. So this is just knowledge that's had been there for decades. We were just the first group to actually like learn how to master it, and then leverage it and scale it in a business sense.
And I'm like still just using the movie as like the perspective, like of like how it went down. And I know you said it's kind of pretty far from it, but there's like in the movie there's a big piece of like evading the casinos. Is that like a legitimate piece of it? Is like, how did you guys fly under the radar and not get caught?
That dynamic's very real, yeah. In terms of for longevity, right? You got to fool the casino. So one of the things that was really key to our success was when we made it a team activity. Because most people who count cards do so on an individual basis, but we employed a team strategy. So the way it worked is we called it the big player strategy. So for example, like if I would go to Vegas, I'd play the part of the big player. And so as the big player, I would go into a casino with multiple spotters. Now the job of a spotter, they were just to blend into the casino crowd, and then they would keep track of the count from the start of a new shuffle. And in the beginning, they wouldn't even play. They would just stand behind the tables and watch. And then when the count moved into the player's favor, they would signal that they had we called it a hot shoe. And our signal was so simple, they just crossed their arms, right? This is very natural. Like in the movie, I don't know if you remember.
They like cross behind their back.
Which was so ridiculous, but obviously they did it for the sake of the movie.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I remember the Lawrence Fishburne casino security character saying, "Oh, did you see that?" As if, like, how could you not see it? It's like so ridiculous. It's one of the many things that made me laugh in the movie. Now, as soon as I saw that hot signal, I would then approach the table, and when I arrived, the spotter would pass off the count using a code word. So for the number 11, we used the code word football, right? Some very obvious associations, right? 11 players on offense and defense. Now, the key when we transferred the count off was to not make eye contact at all, because the cameras obviously are recording the visual, but they don't record audio. So the spotter, they'd be aware that I was coming, but then as I arrived, they just look the other way and they just say football.
Huh.
And as soon as I hear football, I know the count's 11, and then I can just sit down and then capitalize on the advantage with the big bets, betting proportionally to what that advantage is. And as soon as I took over, the spotter would then walk away to find another favorable table. So with multiple spotters, your sampling rate goes way up as compared to someone playing solo, right? So if you have 4 spotters with you, you're going to get a minimum 4 times as many tables counted per hour, but even more because a spotter can be really mobile. Because since they weren't even playing, like if the count of a table went pretty negative, they could just jump to another new table.
Right.
So it was actually even more, it was actually greater than a linear increase, right? So the more tables you count per hour, the more favorable counts you're going to get and the more money you're going to make. It's pretty straightforward.
Right.
So from a mathematical standpoint, it really boosted our expected outcome. But then the second aspect of that strategy, which was so critical, was the whole art of the game, because you have to fool the casino,
right,
as you pointed out. So when we started to employ this strategy, for example, when I got called into a hot shoe, the casinos didn't suspect me of anything because from their vantage point, how can I possibly know what the count was? I wasn't, because card counter, you have to count from the beginning of a new shuffle. I wasn't even there.
Yeah.
And so that camouflage was really, really critical,
pivotal,
and powerful. So then I would just be jumping from table to table. Ideal situation, I get called in, put down the big bets, take advantage of that advantage. The count is going to drop on average, right? Because the count, it wants to go back to 0, right? Because when all those high cards come out, the count's going to go back to 0. It's going to even out.
Right.
And then hopefully at that point, a different spotter is going to have a hot shoe for me, and I can just bounce over there. So that's how it worked. The team strategy really significantly boosted the sampling rate, the hourly win rate, and then provided that really important advantage of the camouflage for longevity.
Were you guys really wearing disguises, or is that not, that was dramatized?
Now, over time, we did have to start employing some disguises because with high stakes blackjack, one of the hard things is even if you have a good act and a good persona and they like you, over time, the thing that's going to kind of give you away is just the consistency and magnitude of your wins. Right?
This guy never loses.
I mean, it's one thing to win on one trip. That's good for the casinos, right? The gamblers have to win.
Yeah.
Sometimes, if they never won,
they'd never come back.
They would never come back, yeah. Right? So it's kind of the house advantage is kind of in an ideal range where it gives players this false illusion they can win. But yeah, if you're winning consistent enough over time, then at some point, someone in the casino who has some concept of probabilities and statistics is going to look at your outcome and say, hey, this player should have lost X, but they won Y. Wow, that doesn't match up. And so once they start watching you closely, it's pretty tough. So I started to get asked not to play at certain casinos, then we started to use disguises. We first started off with low tech, baseball caps, maybe glasses, and then moved into some, for the guys, fake mustaches and so forth. I think the most elaborate we tried was I flew to LA and met with a Hollywood makeup artist, and we got a whole Fat Man suit made, which was actually, it looked pretty good.
Wow.
But then you have to do the rest of the whole get up. Like
Pretty time consuming.
Pretty time consuming. And then for all the effort, didn't work as well as we had hoped. The problem is, like, once someone from a casino or anyone knows you really well,
they're looking for you. And
you come back and they might not recognize you right away, but then if they're directed to watch this player because they're winning, they're probably gonna recognize you, right? I mean, so like, the Hollywood makeup stuff, it doesn't work as well in real life as it does in the movies, right?
Right.
But in the movies, you're kind of like, you're going along with it.
Right. And obviously, like, you're not a card counter anymore, or maybe you are, but what was kind of like the demise of just obviously you guys just won too much, right? Is that kind of how it ended?
Yeah, ultimately, just victims of our own success over time. So we had a really good 6-year run, after which gradually over time, the casinos like began to identify like all of our key players. And then our team actually had a profound impact on the industry too, because they started to learn more about our MOs, how we operated, and then the information sharing really improved, like between casinos, for example, and different like security networks. And so that really exponentially kind of will burn down your career, right? Because if every single casino had to figure out on their own that I was a card counter, I would have been able to play 100 times as much.
Yeah.
But then once you get to a certain level of notoriety and the information sharing increases, and this happened a lot towards the end of my career, I could come into a casino for the first time and they would know who I am, right? Just from the quote unquote black book.
Was MIT cool with you guys playing?
Well, MIT wasn't really aware. I mean, discretion is like a huge part of professional blackjack. They weren't really aware of it. I think they didn't become fully aware until after the movie came out.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
That's super interesting.
Yeah, they've never wanted to have like any type of official association with the team. Like, for example, they wanted to film the movie, or at least part of it, at MIT, but MIT refused, particularly when they saw how the professor in the movie was kind of unscrupulous.
Yeah.
And I get it. They obviously have have a great reputation, so they can gain all the advantages of the MIT card counting team story, but they don't want to have any official affiliation.
Have you ever tried since to just like show up at a casino just to see if you can play again, or do they notice you right away?
Oh, they noticed me right away.
Really?
I mean, like, funny story. After I was forced into retirement, and then I got into the data science consulting. So I used to have a business partner with the analytics. So back when the Cosmopolitan Casino first opened, I went there with my business partner, Brian, to meet with the head of marketing because they were interested in us doing an analytics engagement. And so as we're walking through the casino, Brian, he's not a gambler, card counter, but of course he's very familiar with my card counting background. So as we're passing through, Brian turns to me and says, "Mike, do you think the casino knows you're here?" And I looked at him like he was being silly. I said, "Why would they know I'm here? I'm not even near a blackjack table." And then funnily enough, we get to the restaurant where we're going to have our meeting, and we're waiting out front, and my cell phone rings, and I see it's Jeff Murphy, who's the head of surveillance at Cosmopolitan, because ironically I've become really good friends with a lot of the top surveillancing people in the country, because after the movie 21 came out, I would get invited to come speak at conferences. And so I knew it wasn't a coincidence that Jeff was calling me. So I answered. The first thing I said was, "How the hell do you know I'm here?" And he was laughing. He wasn't mad. He just said,
yeah. And
I told him why we were there. And he said, "Hey, so after your meeting, do you want to get a tour of the surveillance room? My team would love to meet you." And I said, "Sure." So we had the meeting, then Jeff comes down and meets us, and it was pretty cool because he brought us up to, it was like literally floor 3.5. Because the thing about surveillance teams in casinos, they're like sequestered from all the other employees because they're kind of the overseers. And so not many people get to go into those surveillance rooms. And as we got to the door, what was so funny is when Brian and I were waiting from the restaurant, we were looking up at one of the Cosmopolitan, like, amazing chandeliers. I don't know if you've ever been there, but they have a number of these crazy, like, ridiculously amazing chandeliers on the property. They took a picture of us. So we looked kind of a little bit suspicious because we were, like, looking up, like, Spirit and I. But what they did is they printed that picture out, and they blew it up, printed it out, and they taped it to the door. And they wrote "Public Enemy" for a prank. And we got to the door, and it was hilarious. I mean, Brian loved it. He asked if he could take it with them, and he was like, "Yeah, you guys are going to put me in the black book now, right?"
Yeah.
So I got to meet, like, the surveillance team. They were great. And then I kind of learned how they recognized me. It turned out that the newest member of the team, he'd only been there for 4 months, new to the industry. Well, some of the surveillance teams, they'll get tasked with being the face person. And their job is to learn, like, oh, these are the top, they call them advantage players. Players like myself who legally gain an edge over the house. So they have to learn the faces and names. And I've heard this from so many surveillance people, like I was like the first face.
Really?
That they learned.
Wow.
So he just happened to see me walk by the cage. And he's like, oh, isn't that guy, Mike Aponte? And then he contacted Jeff, and Jeff's like, oh, that's Mike. And so he gave me a call.
You had to, like, go back eventually to, you know, after your 6-year run, like, being a normal guy. What were your, like, takeaways from that experience that you, like, can apply into your life now? Like, what did you learn from that experience being a card counter and working for the team, with the team?
Yeah, there were some big takeaways, and a number of them I didn't crystallize right away. They kind of crystallized over time in my post-card counting career. I mean, one of the obvious ones that I was cognizant of during my card counting experience was, like, the power of making data-driven decisions. Obviously, that's kind of what card counting is about, right? Making decisions based on the true odds, which is the complete opposite of how gamblers play, right? They're going based off, like, intuition and maybe some advice they get from their buddy at the table. And power, I mean, the interesting thing for me about card counting, it was my first real-life application of probability and statistics. And so it's one thing to study something in school, but it's another to, like, you know, go and, like, lose $20,000 on the hand, right? Or win $100,000 in the weekend, right? You're getting that real-world feedback, right? So it has a very, very different impact. And so the value of making data-driven decisions, it comes from the fact that as human beings, like, we all inherently just have blind spots in terms of how we perceive the world. We make decisions often, like, we're very emotional creatures, and I'm prone to the same thing. Yeah. To this day, like emotions and subconscious motivations, optimism bias. A lot of times we think something is right because we want it to be true, right? I'm sure you've seen that
100%,
especially with entrepreneurs, right? Like, no, this is the right strategy, right? This is gonna.
I call it drinking the Kool-Aid or mad scientist disease.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's the same thing. And so what I kind of realized over time is that. And then once I got into the real world and got into doing data science analytics, I realized that even, like, it was amazing, even at the C level of, like, these big corporations, I would have these, like, meetings, consultations, and they were making decisions in much the same way that gamblers do at the blackjack tables, right? Just based on feelings or intuitions and not being cognizant of it, right?
Huh.
And I think that's
a good point.
Yeah, and what you were talking about, drinking the Kool-Aid, that's a big part of it, right? I've witnessed it so many times that you'll have the most senior person in the room. They have an idea, and then everyone just says, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea," right? I mean, they just reinforce it, right, because it's in their best interest. Yeah. And then now it just kind of
snowballs.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I remember meeting with the head of the chief marketing officer for like a major corporation. She was refreshingly honest. She said, and they weren't doing well at that time. She said, honestly, I feel like we're just kind of guessing, at what we're, these marketing decisions, right? And I think the key is to get to a point where you kind of have that balance where you have to have objective data, but then intuition, if it's cultivated and developed over time, that definitely has a really powerful place too.
I agree.
And there's some decisions where intuition has no place. Like if you have an ace 4 in blackjack and the dealer has a 6, there's no intuition. You double down. But then there's other decisions where, especially when you're dealing with people, or you're deciding whether to take on some new partnership, strategically, intuition has to play or should play a key role in that, right? Because there's things that go beyond variables that you can quantify clearly.
So making that transition from card counting into, what the common man would say is the normal life, did you hit some adversity? Was it difficult to make that transition?
It was very difficult. Yeah. The thing I quickly realized when I transitioned into the quote unquote real world is that I had been in a bit of a vacuum for quite a while since the start of my freshman year at MIT. So obviously MIT people are very, for example, rational. They're good at, math and science, and then take that to a whole new level with the card counting team, right? We're actually leveraging that in a way. But then also, I was really lucky in that I worked with people that not only were intelligent, but they were really reliable. And, I did have a big hand in that, being one of the chief recruiters for the team. And so obviously we looked for the soft skills and the trust that was really big. But then when I entered in the real world, I think the thing I grappled with the most is that people are unreliable. For example, they don't do what they say they're going to do. And I was in a bit of denial. I was kind of stuck on why are they like this? And then my now wife, she told me, because she had been working in the real world, she's like, you're going to have to readjust your perception of how things should be. Otherwise it's going to be tough for you. And so, yeah, I think that's arguably the toughest thing to deal with from a business standpoint, especially for entrepreneur, is people.
And we had the conversation the other day when I was at the airport, and you had a really interesting perspective, how you described how those things that seem kind of abstract, like a person, it's out of control, but it is really just there's a statistical foundation to it. And same with adversity, encountering adversity, although it feels like it's out of your control and may make you feel like you want to run, really it's just a statistical data point on your way to that success. Can you talk a little bit more about that? You can articulate it better than I can.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I've over time, I like to use these analogies. I think blackjack, card counting, there's so many useful analogies for me, at least, as far as kind of the analogous examples in the real world, right? So for example, in terms of dealing with adversity and quote unquote bad luck, back during my playing days, the count could be really high. I could bet 2 hands of 10,000 because it is clearly in my favor. And then the dealer, for example, could pull 5 card 21, which is really unlikely. And that's obviously improbable and unlucky. But back when I played, and this is one of the reasons I was successful, it didn't faze me even for a second. I would just move on to the next round. What's the next bet? What's the next play? Right. But then what I realized over time is that when it's after card counting, when I would have quote unquote bad luck, it was a lot harder for me to deal with emotionally. Because you have a real person to actually blame. There were times where I would definitely like start slipping into a bit of like victim mentality. But then I kind of realized, I'm like, this is exactly the same thing as the dealer pulling 5 card 21, right? It's a statistical distribution. I mean, another really simple example that everyone can relate to. I'm like a pretty calm, laid back guy, but one of my weaknesses used to be getting upset at bad drivers. Like I never had like outright road rage or anything, but just internally, I would get really worked up. And then I just, one of the things that helped me was like, it's part of the statistical terrain. Like there is going to be X% of drivers that are bad. Like, why are you surprised?
Yeah, it's good to be able to separate the emotion from that. Like, I see a lot of times with my sales guys, they get it's so personal to them when they get rejected on the phones or something. And it's like, it's really just like a statistical data point. If you just take the emotion out of it and say, okay, like every person that rejects me just puts me that much closer to someone who is going to need the services, that it's like a lot smaller pill to swallow. Exactly. I mean, you realize not only doesn't it serve you, but to take it another step, you realize you're being irrational. It's like, do you really expect there to be 0 bad drivers? Like, what world are you living in? Right. In the same way as a salesman, is the reality, are they going to close 100% of leads? No way. Yeah. So that's just part of the whole process. And so, I mean, that's like another big lesson that took me a while to crystallize. When I look back at the card counting, one of the reasons I was so good is I just focused on the process, like control what you can control. So as a card counter, the things you can control with 100% certainty is keeping accurate track of the count, making the correct playing decision on your hand every time, putting out the optimal bet every time it moves into your favor, the advantage. But the thing is, you could have done all that perfectly, and then when you put out the big bets, at that point, you don't have control of the cards that come out. You could lose. Right. And I was really good at dealing with those losses and focusing on the process over and over. But it was much tougher for me to deal with the same dynamic away from the blackjack tables, right? So that's the key, like focus on process. So you have to know what the outcome is, like the long term, but be consistent, right? Be consistent and don't get caught. I think for entrepreneurs, and I know from experience, there's a strong tendency to measure like, oh, I didn't make any significant progress, seemingly significant progress towards my end goal. When in reality, if you actually just did the things you're supposed to do, you did. And there'll be days where you actually feel like you went backwards, but if you're objective about it, you're like, no, you actually did the right things. And so like failure in life, in entrepreneurship, and in blackjack is the key to success. Because most people are surprised when they ask me, oh, what percent of hands, blackjack hands do card counters win? And they're expecting me to say like 70, 80, 90, some crazy percentage. The fact is that all blackjack players, including the best card counters in the world, will always lose more hands than they win. And that comes from the fact that you have the opportunity to bust first as a player. So as soon as you bust, you lose, even if the dealer busts. That's where the house really gets his advantage. So then naturally, the question that comes on the heels of that is, well, then how do you win as a card counter if you're going to lose most of your hands? It's like, well, you have to play consistently, and then identify the situations where your advantage is in your favor, and then you bet more money, right? So the path in terms of like win-loss of a card counter is very volatile. It's up and down, and most of the time it's actually down, right? If you're losing over half your hands, you're going to be... You just want to make sure the bets are small in those times, right? Like that's how you control it, is by fluctuating the bets. And when it's hot, then you're betting big and winning big.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So your bankroll most of the time as a card counter is below its all-time high. It's not a smooth linear ascent. It's up and down. And I think entrepreneurship is very much like that. You're going to have days and definitely even stretches where you feel like not only aren't you making any progress, but you're going backwards. And you actually might very well be negative in terms of, your bottom line, right? Your burn rate. But it's all about just got to stay on track. Like consistency is going to win out over intensity over the long run. I think intensity, it's definitely called for at certain times where you're going to have to pull all-nighter or work crazy hours a particular week. But I think it's overrated and overpraised by our culture. And being consistent every day, that's something that I think should be talked about more.
And we had a really big realization with my company recently. And over the past year and a half, we've got a CRM system, so we started tracking a lot more data with the cold callers. And on this most recent batch of cold calling guys, and I have straight commission sales guys, so it's pretty there's a big psychological aspect to it. Is showing them to defer the gratification and realize that if you put in the time and you just take the emotion out of it and make it a numbers game, I'll show you exactly what the projection is. If you make X amount of calls, this should be the translation. But when we do the calls in the morning, the guys they're trading tips back and forth. Someone's saying oh, I said this and it worked, and I use this strategy. And what's really funny that I realized is that every single person on our team had the exact same percentage of where the outcome we're trying to get is site inspections, the exact same percentage of site inspections calls they made. So all the other variables didn't matter. It just came down to who made the most calls, got the most site inspections. That's pretty profound to me. It's which I've backed off a lot on nitpicking trading, because it's just if you're consistent and you show up every single day, eventually the results are going to come, and it's not weighted. There is no I'm sure you can get an advantage, on that process, but at the end of the day, the more calls that they make, that distribution becomes more even between the team, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, you're just showing up and putting in the work.
Yeah,
is over half the battle, right?
Absolutely.
Although it's interesting, it's interesting that you didn't see maybe a little bit of variation, but you said it pretty much
2% across the board.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And that might be true. There's different when it comes
maybe
to
we just got lucky when I checked the report, but.
Well, in different types of sales and processes, there's going to be less variability, right? And it is really just going to be driven in by the volume, and there's going to be other instances where the potential variability would be greater. But that's awesome that you measured that, and
it's hard to have with people when you're communicating with people, which is what cold sales is, to say one strategy is going to give you an edge. You have so many different variables of the people that you're communicating with. So I feel the advantage that you're getting using this strategy that works with 10 people, ends up hurting you with the opposite type of person. So it ends up evening out, just to the amount of calls. You would have to really get an edge, you'd have to be able to have super strong interpersonal skills and be able to read do an interrogation and analyze what that personality type is, and then curtail your strategy to that person instead of just using one strategy and thinking that's going to give you the edge. So maybe you can get an edge, but they weren't, through their strategies, their little tips and tricks. It was still an even distribution.
Well, it's usually the case with most processes. There's going to be that one simple thing that if you do right, it's going to get you 70 to 90%.
Right.
Of the result. And I think, we're always, this human nature, we're always looking for that silver bullet, right?
Right.
And obviously that presents the opportunity. There's so many people out there selling the magic solution, right?
In your entrepreneurial journey, what is your silver bullet? If there's one thing that you, Mike, today could tell Mike that started off early in his career, what piece of advice would you give yourself?
Well, I definitely don't have any silver bullets, for sure. I guess it's just more insight. I wish I could say wisdom because I had to learn the hard way. But if I could tell the younger version of myself something, I would tell the younger version of myself is that when you want to do things that are really aspirational, like in business or take on certain projects, you just have to know that hand in hand with that are going to be a lot of ups and downs, like that statistical variation, right? A lot of like bad luck. And I think just knowing that from the beginning you just kind of accept it. And in a way, you can, often like human emotion and disappointment, it stems from there being that gap between expectations and reality, right? But from the beginning, if you can like set the proper framework, you aren't going to have that gap's going to be minimal. And then if you really develop yourself, you can actually use those trials and tribulations. You can actually just change the whole frame on it and say, and look at it as a challenge and even enjoy it, right? I think that's what the most successful people do.
How do you define success? It's different from everyone, so I always like to ask that question, see like what your definition is.
There's definitely different aspects of success. I would say that there's clearly the financial success, business success. I think that's another, you asked me what I would tell my younger self. That's a perfect segue. I think when it comes to, like, for example, ROI, we think of ROI in terms of financial terms naturally, because that's something we can quantify. Now, one of the big lenses I look through in terms of how to spend my time, because time is so valuable. Right. That's something when you're younger, you don't value your time as much. I think part of it too, you also do tend to have more time the younger you are because you have less responsibility, right? Family, for example. But now I look at things as like, okay, there are things that I have to do, right? Like I just had to spend, a few days preparing taxes, right? That's not fun. I always never look forward to that, but that's something you objectively have to do. But our have to do list is actually much smaller than we think it is, right? For example, there are people in the past, there would be people that would maybe want to meet or have dinner when in reality, I don't really click with them, right? I'm sure we kind of have all that. Like there's not going to be like a mutual benefit, but I would go spend 2-3 hours with them just out of some sense of obligation, right? Of being like quote unquote nice person. So now, like for example, even like me joining you here today, they went through my filter. Like, is this something I really want to do? And the answer is yes, right? And it doesn't come from a financial return,
right?
It comes from like, oh, is this something that I'm going to enjoy doing? And obviously, like when I actually spoke to you on the phone, that's where I could instantly, get that confirmation. Oh, this is we definitely have a good meeting of the minds as someone that
I appreciate you saying that.
Would want to have a good conversation. And then it also helps that we were referred by a really good mutual friend,
yep.
Connor Holloway, who acts as that was a great filter. So as you get older, you need to have a finer filter for how you spend your time and energy. And I think one of the big check boxes now is, especially if I'm going to be taking like a major undertaking, like a major project, I ask myself, if this thing fails, which it can fail. Like,
right.
You don't want to, optimism bias always wants to make you think, oh, this is definitely going to succeed. But no, the reality is it can fail. If it fails, will I look back and regret having, worked with these people or spent the time and energy on this work?
That's a great point.
And if the answer is no, then I'll do it, right? But if the answer is like, I'm not sure or yes, then now I won't make that type of investment. And part of that is you just have to learn over time. When you're young, you don't know what you don't know. So it's okay. You have to increase your surface area, right? It's better. You need to get out there, right? It goes back to the whole failure is the key to success. Like you have to get real world feedback, right? You can plan and strategize and analyze, which I'm very prone to do, to a fault. But at some point, you do have to get like real world feedback. You do have to get out there and meet people. You do have to go out there and actually try things, right? So that's where the whole art of it is. Like you have how do you balance and optimize it, and it's so individual too, because we all have different values.
Is increasing your surface area like one of the biggest pieces of advice that you would give like a new entrepreneur that's like, or someone who's trying to make the leap? And like also like you're obviously an advocate for entrepreneurship, so why would you recommend someone who's on the cusp trying to make that decision if they want to go into entrepreneurship? What are kind of like the benefits, pros and cons
of entrepreneurship? Yeah, I mean the pros are that you have the opportunity to pursue something that you are truly passionate about and that can bring you like the ultimate fulfillment, right? Because that old saying, like, something's not work if you truly love it. And this, like, if you actually really do love what you're doing, you're going to need that for when it gets hard, right? Like for the card counting, for example, people just naturally, especially if they see the movie, they focus on all the superficial. They think it was just like fun and games and like we're out there partying. It's a grind.
Yeah.
Like when we flew out to Vegas, we were partying. That was like valuable time to play. Like we'd arrive in Vegas, get the hotel, we'd play till like 4 a.m., rest during the day, get back at it. And there were times where it's definitely a grind, but I even enjoyed the grind because I just, I loved all of it, right? Whereas if you were just doing it, and this happened, we had recruits where, and maybe it wasn't their fault because card counting is so unique, you can't really know what it's all about until you do it, where they just ended up dropping out or they couldn't really cut it, not because they didn't have the ability, they just didn't have the drive to do that. So that's like, entrepreneurship really provides you that opportunity, right, to do something meaningful and purposeful. And it's a great way to really learn a lot about yourself as well. Like it's one of the best tools for growth, right? Without a doubt.
So we'll kind of wrap it up here after this, but like, is there any final comments that you would give to like someone that's listening to this? Like a big underlying theme of this show is like trying to catalyze that decision for people to chase their dreams and journey into entrepreneurship. What would be your like kind of final comments to someone of that demographic?
Yeah, I think if you're someone that's thinking about taking that leap, one of the biggest obstacles is fear, right? Like humans, we're just going back to our early days. We're just wired to be averse to uncertainty. So like fear is something we really magnify. I can't remember who it was, but I heard this quote where fear is like, for most of us, it looks like an ocean where it looks so huge, but when you actually step into it and see it for its right, it turns out that most of the time, it's only a foot deep.
Right.
And I think the best way to get into entrepreneurship is to just start. And you can do that on a part-time basis, right? Just start off and then think of it. You have to go for the long game, right? You're going to have to put in, and you've probably heard this, right, with your podcast. One of the biggest with podcasts, there is this really impressive stat that if you can make it to it was some low number of like 20 episodes, that would put you in the top 1 percentile.
Wow.
All podcasts and
we got a goal now.
But yeah, you hear like the top podcasters, or you hear this, for YouTube, YouTube channels, like the people that are really successful, they say don't even think about money or the final outcome. Your goal should be to make 100 videos or 100 podcast episodes and then learn along the way.
Right.
Because your 100th podcast is going to be infinitely better
than the first
one. And you hear this from like the top, like Chris Williamson in Modern Wisdom is like one of my favorite. he said it's great to look back at his early stuff. He kind of it's like looking at what the 5-year-old version of himself. But at the same time, that he has to be really proud.
Yeah, you watch, like, Joe Rogan has an episode where he talks about his first episode, and if you go back and watch his first episode, they were doing it on, like, Skype or Zoom or something, and there's, like, bubbles coming up on the camera because they couldn't figure out how to take the filter off on Skype. So the entire podcast, it's like, there's, like, animated bubbles coming up the screen because they had no clue. I mean, you look where he's at now, but, like, it's just, like, hilarious to think about.
Yeah, I mean, things that are meaningful and worthwhile, they take time, like the power of consistency, right? So to look at it in terms of the long game and then focus on the process and then try. This is something I've been really bad at, but I'm working hard at, like really try to be in the moment too and enjoy it. And yeah, enjoy your little victories and enjoy, getting some... In a given day, if you get some tasks which a lot of people might look at as mundane, give yourself credit for that.
Right. So if people want to find you and learn more about you, or maybe reach out, where's like a good place for them to look for you? Is there any channels? Do you have a website or anything like that?
Yeah, they can reach out to me or they learn more information on my website, which is simply mikeaponte.com.
Okay, great. Well, Mike, I appreciate you coming out and joining us. This is extremely interesting. So thanks again.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right, guys, that concludes this episode of Shaking Hands. I'm your host, Jack Moran. You can find me on Instagram at bluecollarkid. If you like what you saw, please continue watching. And if you have any feedback, people that you want to see, questions that you want to hear asked, please reach out to me. But other than that, tune in next time for some more interesting conversations and people. See ya.